Okay, be honest. When you think of the people who invented artificial intelligence, who comes to mind? Elon Musk? Sam Altman? Some guy in a hoodie at MIT? Yeah, you'd be wrong. The guy who actually started all this AI stuff. Not a tech billionaire, not even a computer scientist. He was a psychologist. And here's the really strange part. He built the first machine that could learn on its own in 1958. The press called it the first serious rival to the human brain. Then, he was forgotten. Completely. His name is Frank Rosenblatt. And his story, it's tragic, bizarre, and absolutely mind-blowing. Let's go back. The genius and the machine. Frank Rosenblatt was born in 1928 into a Jewish family in New Rochelle, New York. He was brilliant. Went to the Bronx High School of Science, got his PhD in psychology from Cornell. But here's where it gets interesting. He wasn't just interested in how people think. He wanted to build a machine that could think like a person. So in 1957, he started working on something called the Perceptron. Now imagine this. It's the 1950s. Computers are massive, room-sized machines that weigh tons. And Rosenblatt builds this incredible device, the Mark I Perceptron, based on the biology of the human brain. It had 400 light sensors, arranged in rows like a mechanical eye. It could recognize patterns. It could learn. It was the first machine that could teach itself new skills by trial and error. In 1958, the US Navy unveiled it to the world. And the world went nuts. The New York Times ran a headline, "New Navy device learns by doing." The New Yorker called it the first serious rival to the human brain ever devised. One newspaper even screamed, "Shades of Frankenstein." People were terrified, excited, convinced that the age of thinking machines had arrived. But then, boom, everything fell apart. The fall and the forgetting. See, not everyone was impressed. Two MIT researchers, Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert, decided to tear Rosenblatt's work apart. They wrote a book called Perceptrons, and in it, they mathematically proved that Rosenblatt's machine had major limitations. Now here's the thing. They weren't entirely wrong. The Perceptron did have limits, but the damage was done. The scientific community turned against neural networks. Funding dried up. The field entered what we now call the AI winter. Decades of stagnation and neglect. For 20 years, the field was basically dead. Students were told not to study neural networks. Papers on the subject were rejected on sight. And Rosenblatt? He was humiliated. His life's work was publicly dismissed. He kept researching, but the glory was gone. He moved on to other strange experiments, like injecting brain extracts from trained rats into untrained ones to see if they'd learn faster. Then, on July 11th, 1971, his 43rd birthday, he went sailing on the Chesapeake Bay. He never came back. His boat was found drifting. His body was never recovered. A boating accident. That's all they said. Frank Rosenblatt died believing he had failed. His ideas were buried. His name was forgotten. For decades, almost nobody remembered the psychologist who tried to build a brain. The twist. But here's where it gets wild. Because Rosenblatt's ideas, they never died. They just waited. In the 1980s, a new generation of researchers, including a guy named Geoffrey Hinton, started building on Rosenblatt's work. They created more complex neural networks that could do what the Perceptron couldn't. And today, every time you use ChatGPT, DALL-E, or any AI, you're using a direct descendant of Frank Rosenblatt's Perceptron. It's just a software version now, with way more layers nodes and connections. But the core idea, the thing that started it all, was his. He's now called the father of deep learning. But most people have never heard his name. Conclusion. So what does this tell us? It tells us that history isn't always fair. Sometimes the people who change the world die thinking they failed. Sometimes the people who lay the foundations get buried by the very buildings they built. Frank Rosenblatt was erased from history, not by enemies, not by war, but by indifference. By the arrogance of the scientific establishment, by the AI winter that his own work helped create. He was the man who built the first spark of artificial intelligence. And then for 50 years, nobody remembered his name. But the story doesn't end there, because today, his ideas are everywhere. And every time we ask an AI a question, we're proving Frank Rosenblatt right. He just never got to see it. Frank Rosenblatt is one story. But there are thousands more waiting to be told. The forgotten geniuses, the buried inventions, the people history tried to erase. That's what this channel is all about. This is Oddyssey. We dig up the weird, the forgotten, and the unbelievable every week. Subscribe if you want more stories that history tried to bury. Because trust me, this is just the tip of the iceberg. History isn't always fair. But one thing it can never do, it can't bury the truth forever. They tried to bury it, we dig it back up. History is stranger than fiction. See you next time.